the sort of chickeniness of something, the species flavor, species specific flavors were driven by fat, not protein. That was like a big realization that like goat tastes like goat because of its fats and what it, and then vis-a-vis what the animal ate, its diet. Have you like honed in on like what makes sort of the pork flavor Porky? Like have you been able to do that? And to the extent you can talk about it, of course. Like
it's a good question. The short answer is no. We haven't done that much characterization work on that sensory optimization. I think there's a lot of ample opportunity there for whatever those aromas or those molecules are to enhance them. What we have worked on are the nutritionals. So one thing that we've been surprised about is the fact that how much the pork fat cells are what they eat. So for example, if we want to make an omega-3 rich pork fat, all that involves is giving the cells more omega-3. If we want to have a lower saturated fat pork fat, that just involves giving the cells less saturated fat. And so that's been something that we've looked at from a characterization perspective. We find that our product is basically like lard, where once you add it to a protein or whatever other product and you cook it, that's really when the flavors are extenuated and when there's a big sensory differential that is produced within whatever you're adding it to. Just going back to kind of one of the operating principles is if you're making the same thing in a different way, you should get the same sensory experience. I think that's true. And we're finding that to be true. And I think that is what's doing most of the driving, not as much understanding specifically what is in that thing or, because that's kind of been the challenge. No one's really been able to understand that. So no one's really been able to recreate that.
A lot of people here know some of this, some don't, but just want to make sure we're on the same page. But I wanted to follow up on something specific you said. Yeah. There's an interesting thing about how cells grow. You mentioned, if I want the omega-3s to go up, I add omega-3s. How much of this of fat, I think people don't realize, like when you're growing adipose tissue, fat tissue or cells, how much of it is just absorption of like fats that are available to them that they then accumulate effectively inside the cell versus how much they use something to synthesize it and make it into a fat? Like what's that breakdown like for the process?
Totally. Without talking about trade secret that we have internally too much. Basically, one of the reasons why we chose to go with pork fat is because actually most of the fatty acids, so these are the when you talk about saturated fats or monounsaturated fats or trans fats, those are actually pertaining to particular types of fatty acids. So the fatty acids that the body makes, that all usually happens inside the liver, for example, in humans, inside the liver. And that's the case in most farm animals. Pigs uniquely make those fatty acids in the actual fat cells. So an advantage to working with pig cells is that when they're becoming fat cells, they don't need any extra machinery or any other organ, or you don't need to be growing any other cell type to have that same fatty acid production happen. And so you have the option of both giving the feed sources of how they make the fat, of what they make the fat with, to them. For example, these are very simple molecules we're all kind of familiar with: glucose, glutamine, which is just an amino acid. You can either give those feed sources to the cells and have them create those fatty acids that they then put into their fat droplet, or you can give them their fatty acids directly. And once you give them those fatty acids directly, they will incorporate those into that same fat droplet that they're forming internally. And the extent to which they choose to do either one of these two things is driven by kind of what you feed them and what you signal to them to do. So there's a lot of tunability there. We currently use somewhat of a combination of both. So it is a little bit of what they're fed, and it's a little bit of what they want to make kind of naturally.
That's fascinating. I didn't realize that pig cells didn't have to rely on the liver per se. For fatty acid synthesis. That's really fascinating. And it's interesting because you often see that pigs and humans are often compared as very comparable biology. But humans rely on our liver to synthesize the fatty acids.
I was surprised too. Yeah, for that exact reason. I think a lot of us coming from like the biomedical space, right, see that pigs are often like a model organism, but there are always, these key differences. That's why no model organism is perfect.